Welcome back to an introduction to breast cancer. I'm Dr. Anise Chagpar. I am so pleased to have you with me today. This is one of my favorite topics. Over the last several sessions, we've talked a lot about breast cancer, and in each module, we've talked about clinical trials. Why? Because clinical trials really are the foundation, the building blocks that we use to make treatments better. Let's look more at clinical trials. Let's get started. So one question that patients often ask, and indeed many of you may ask, is why bother participating in clinical trials? Aside from the fact that this is Dr. Chagpar's most favorite thing ever. Well, there are a few good reasons. The first is that we know that patients who participate in clinical trials tend to do better than patients who don't. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, it makes intuitive sense. We're always comparing standard of care to what we think is better. So if you average things out, on average, people participating in clinical trials tend to do better. So, just for selfish reasons alone, there's a good reason to participate in clinical trials. On top of which, oftentimes this is the only way that you can get the most novel therapies today. These are going to be things that become standard of care tomorrow, and you can avail yourself of them early. Now, the second reason to participate in clinical trials is really altruism. And many patients participate in clinical trials for exactly this reason. They know that clinical trials today are what really lay the foundation for better therapies tomorrow. So while a clinical trial may not be of direct benefit to you, it may be of benefit to other people down the line. Now, one key concept is that inclusiveness is key. It's really important for everybody to participate in clinical trials. Why is that? Because if people who are like you don't participate in clinical trials, when we start using the data from those clinical trials across populations, we really don't know whether there's external generalizability. That is to say, if you had a clinical trial based on a bunch of old white men, does that therapy still work on young African American women? We've seen this in other diseases like heart disease, and the same thing plays out in breast cancer. So when we think about novel therapies, you really want to include everybody in these clinical trials so that those results can then be generalized to the entire population. I love this cartoon that says, we have studies of fruit flies in men and hamsters and frogs and monkeys, but medical research with women just hasn't occurred to anybody. Well, we need to be thinking about widespread populations and getting everybody involved. Now, let's talk specifically about phases of therapeutic clinical trials. Oftentimes, when I've referred to clinical trials, I've meant therapeutic trials. That is to say, trials that have an endpoint of either recurrence or survival. Now, you'll often hear people talking about phase 1 trials or phase 2 trials or phase 3 trials, and you may wonder, what are all of these phases? Well, let's break it down. So phase 1 trials tend to be small trials, often with only a handful of patients, and really looking at the safety of a particular drug, device, agent. It's really about novel therapeutics. Is this something that we can use? So we tend to use phase 1 trials in that setting. Now, phase 2 trials are trials that use the data from phase 1 trials after we have an agent that we know is safe. And then we want to know, is it effective? And is it effective in this particular cancer type? So if I have a novel agent that may have been shown to be safe in cancer, is it really effective in breast cancer? That's phase 2 trials. They tend to be a little bit larger than phase 1 trials. But most of the trials that we've talked about in this session are really phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials tend to be large, randomized control trials where we're comparing standard of care to what we think is better, after we already know what is the right dose, that it's safe, that it's effective, But is it better than what we already have? That's what a phase 3 clinical trial answers. Now, clinical trials are not always just therapeutic randomized clinical trials. There are a number of studies that patients can participate in. So there are specimen studies. These are often studies where we're looking at biomarkers, prediction studies. Can I tell what it is in this particular cancer that makes it behave in a certain way? That information is critical, but it doesn't always require a randomized controlled trial. What about prevention trials? Remember back to when we talked about prevention early on? We talked about some of these prevention trials, trials of large populations, giving them one agent versus another, or perhaps placebo, to see whether an agent can actually prevent cancer from ever occurring. And then there are surveys and questionnaires. These are important too. They may not get to the endpoint of recurrence or survival, but they can often ask about quality of life, patient-reported outcomes, as we often call them, or PROs. Important endpoints. And so it's important that you don't ignore all of these other kinds of studies as well. A few things you should know. First, studies have significant regulatory oversight. Historically, people may have had some trepidation about participating in clinical trials. They may be wary about being used as a human guinea pig and whether there's some ulterior motives for researchers. You should know that these days, when research is conducted, there are a number of layers of research oversight that really make sure that there's integrity on the part of the researchers and that the studies are being conducted according to good clinical practice. So, being used as a human guinea pig is often not a big consideration. So know that there is oversight. The second key consideration is that you can always withdraw. So let's say you're participating in a clinical trial, and for whatever reason, you change your mind. Oftentimes in the informed consent form, you'll see a paragraph that says something to the degree of, at any point during this clinical trial, you can withdraw. And that does not affect the treatment that you'll receive in terms of good clinical practice. So know that you're always in control, and at any point, you can say no thank you. Now, we always hope that you're going to participate in these clinical trials right to the end, because that allows us to get as much information that really helps us to provide the best care for future generations. But know that you have some control. Now, the third consideration, particularly for people living in the United States, is with regards to the Affordable Care Act. Now, some people were always a bit concerned about whether insurance would cover their usual care when they participate in a clinical trial, or whether their insurance company would say, sorry, when you're in a clinical trial, you bear the costs. Even though many of those costs may be costs that they would have otherwise had to incur as part of usual care that then would have been borne by their insurance company. Well, the Affordable Care Act mandates that that usual care has to be covered by your insurance. So there should be really no reason not to participate in a clinical trial from a financial standpoint. Now, here's a website that I want everyone to go and check out. It's www.clinicaltrials.gov. It's a great website, and all of the clinical trials that are conducted in this country anyways, must be registered on this website. It's a great website to go to, and you can search based on where you are, your location, or the particular disease entity that you want to look at, or whether it's currently accruing patients or not. Remember that when you think about the fact that patients do better on clinical trials, it's nice to see whether there's a clinical trial that they can participate in that's close to where they live. This website can help you to figure that out. There's a lot of verbiage that goes into clinical trials. We talk about randomized controlled trials and IRBs and placebos. Well, let's break down what some of these terms mean. First, an IRB. IRBs are institutional review boards. That's part of that regulatory oversight. So anytime there's a clinical trial, it is always under the domain of the institutional review board. That review board is looking over that clinical trial, making sure that patients are not getting adverse events. All of those have to be reported to the IRB. The IRB is going to make sure that this is done with diligent care, that there's oversight on these clinical trials. IRBs make sure that you as patients are safe and that the researchers have integrity in terms of the design of their studies. Placebo. This is a word that often gets people pretty scared. For many people, they think of this as a sugar pill, and they often wonder, my goodness, I don't want to be in a clinical trial if I could potentially be getting a sugar pill. But remember that the trials that involve placebos are often trials that compare standard of care to something better. And sometimes standard of care is doing nothing. Well, it would be pretty hard to blind people to whether they're getting nothing or something unless we give them something in the standard of care arm. That's where sugar pills or placebos come into play. Randomized control trial, taking a group of patients and randomizing them. That is to say, by flip of the coin, putting half the patients in one group and half the patients in another. Why is randomization so important? It's important because it makes sure that all of the other factors that we sometimes don't think about are evenly distributed between two groups. If you look at some of the trials that we've talked about during this course, and you look at those tables where they show you the two groups, you'll often find that many of the factors, the demographics, the age distribution, the stage distribution, are by magic, it seems, evenly distributed between two groups. That's the magic of randomization. It's really quite cool. But that allows these two groups now to be pretty much even, so that you know that the differences that you see are really based on the treatments that you're giving to the two groups. Double blind. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that your investigators are actually wearing blindfolds, but it does mean that the investigators don't know necessarily which arm you're in, and neither do you. And that way, you really eliminate a lot of bias. It may be if an investigator knew that you were on a particular arm, or you knew that you were in a particular arm, that you might have some feeling that you were going to do better or worse than the other arm. But we want to take out that bias. And so if we don't tell you which arm you're in, you're really at equipoise, and you don't know whether you are biasing results or not. So it's another way to keep everything safe. Stratified. Oftentimes we'll use stratification, so kind of taking out groups of patients and looking to make sure that particular groups are evenly distributed. So we'll stratify based on stage, or we'll stratify based on age, so that we'll get the same number of old people and young people in both arms of a trial, stratifying before we randomize. Now, we've talked about how important clinical trials are, but oftentimes these require many, many patients. So how do we get many, many patients in a clinical trial? There's a few mechanisms. One is cooperative groups. These are groups of oftentimes large bodies that pull together many centers. Now, these cooperative groups will come up with an idea for a clinical trial, and that way, many centers all over the country can participate in these clinical trials, allowing many people to help get outcomes that can ultimately move the field forward. And it also means that patients all over the country can avail themselves of these trials. So you should look up clinicaltrials.gov, look up cooperative groups, and see what clinical trials patients might be eligible for in your institution. Multi-center trials are similar in the sense that they have many centers that are coalescing together to share data, to all participate in one clinical trial. These may not be cooperative groups in the sense that they may not be available to everybody, but only in those particular centers. Still, it allows us to collaborate to try to get these trials done in a fast and effective way. What about other kinds of trials, not randomized controlled trials? We talk about cohort trials and case control trials. Cohort trials, as you can imagine, take a cohort or a group of patients. And then you can follow these patients and see which patients develop an outcome and which patients don't. So you take a group of patients and you say, I'm going to follow these patients forward. Half of these patients smoke, half of these patients don't smoke. We'll see who develops lung cancer. That gives you a sense. Case control trials are similar, but almost backwards. So you have cases of patients who had breast cancer and controls who didn't get breast cancer, and then you go backwards and you see what are the etiologic factors that may have led to those outcomes. This brings us to the last set here, which is prospective studies, ones that go forward in time. These are often randomized controlled trials or cohort studies where we're following a group of patients over time, versus retrospective studies. So studies where we go back in time, we look at data and we say, what caused this? What can we dig out from the data that we already have historically that may have led to these outcomes? Now, this is a key slide, especially for those of you who may be in this field and often are trying to remember all of the key trials that have really brought us to where we are in breast cancer management. It's funny because a lot of this seems like alphabet soup, different trials with different letters and different numbers, trying to remember what all of these are. But these are really landmark trials, many of which we've talked about during this course. Remember the NSABP B04 study? That was the study that randomized people to radical mastectomy, where we removed the pectoral muscles and all of the lymph nodes, to total mastectomy. And the finding was that survival was the same. So we really didn't need to take out muscles and all of the lymph nodes. Critical information as we moved forward, because now we don't do that. The NSABP B06 trial, similarly, was a landmark trial. This was the trial that randomized people to having a total mastectomy, which, remember, was standard of care just back in the 60s, to now breast-conserving surgery. And the finding that these two were equal means that we can give patients these options. Remember back to the surgery section of this course? That was a critical element in what we talked about. What about the NSABP B14 study? This was a study that looked at tamoxifen in estrogen receptor positive invasive cancer. Now this has become standard of care. B18 was the neoadjuvant chemotherapy study. Remember the study that had patients who were randomized to either receive chemotherapy followed by surgery or surgery followed by chemotherapy? Remember how that trial found that the survival rates were the same? So now we can offer patients either of these two strategies, and we know the advantages and disadvantages of each. What about B20? B20 was the study that actually looked at chemotherapy and showed that chemotherapy in breast cancer made a difference. B24 started to look at DCIS, that pre-cancer, and the fact that tamoxifen could benefit patients, particularly now who have ER-positive DCIS, and that has become standard of care. What about B32? B32 was the trial that looked at sentinel node biopsy and showed that really survival was the same, whether you did a sentinel node biopsy followed by axillary node dissection only if the sentinel node was positive, or if you did an axillary node dissection on everybody. Revolutionized standard of care. The B35 trial looked at aromatase inhibitors in DCIS. B39 is looking at accelerated partial breast irradiation. B42 was extended adjuvant therapy. So do you only need 5 years of hormonal therapy, or is 10 years really better? Some of these were still waiting for the long-term results. More trials. MA17, a great trial looking at extended adjuvant therapy after tamoxifen. So this randomized patients who had had 5 years of tamoxifen to placebo versus an aromatase inhibitor. Remember, placebo because standard of care was only 5 years. And so they gave half the patients a placebo, half the patients an aromatase inhibitor after they had finished 5 years of tamoxifen. And this is another study that shows you the value of regulatory oversight, because this study was stopped early. Why? Because the Data Safety and Monitoring Board, who is looking at this trial as it's going along, found, while the study was going along, that one arm was doing much better than the other arm. So they unblinded the trial. And what did they find? They found that the people in the aromatase inhibitor arm were doing better than the placebo arm. Remember, placebo was standard of care. And so the patients who were on the trial, those were the first patients to find out the results of this study, and it was opened up to the world so that everyone now knew that extended adjuvant therapy had a benefit over 5 years of tamoxifen. Again, practice-changing results from clinical trials. MA20 was just recently reported showing the benefit of extended radiation fields. Z11 has become practice-changing, even though it didn't find a statistically significant difference between the two arms. Remember, this was a non-inferiority trial. That means that instead of trying to find that one arm was better than the other, it was trying to find that two arms were equal. One arm, of course, was doing less, so would have less morbidity. Even though the Z11 trial did not meet its target accrual, sadly because too few surgeons put their patients on the trial, too few patients participated in the trial, it still became practice-changing because we looked at the data and found, you know what, maybe we don't need to do an axillary node dissection even if patients have positive nodes. Again, clinical trials, hugely important. The Z1071 trial looked at sentinel node biopsy after neoadjuvant chemotherapy. We had usually forced people to have a sentinel node biopsy before. That meant 2 operations, but this trial demonstrated that it was feasible to do a sentinel node biopsy after neoadjuvant chemotherapy. Prevention trials. The P1 trial showed that tamoxifen could reduce your risk of developing breast cancer by 50%. STAR trial found that raloxifene had an equal reduction of risk. We talked about these two when we looked at prevention. Go back and check it out if you haven't already. And then newer trials are looking at genomics. So the TAILOR-RX trial, just one of the many trials looking at how we can use molecular biology to really tailor therapies. All of these, I hope, give you a flavor of how important these clinical trials are, how they really make a difference, and they're practice changing. So I hope that all of you get as excited as I am about clinical trials. I really like this idea of patients and clinicians and researchers looking down that microscope of clinical trials together. Together, we are going to make treatment better and a brighter tomorrow. So, until next time, I'm Dr. Anise Chagpar. Thanks so much for joining me.